All right. Welcome everyone to our next New Church Visionaries lecture. I'm so happy to see everyone here. And I'm so happy to invite Dr. Devin Zuber. And I'm just going to take a minute to introduce him. He is an associate professor of American Studies, Religion, and Literature at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California. Is currently serving as chair of the Department of Historical and Cultural Studies of Religion. He teaches the GTU's PhD program, Concentrations for Art and Religion, New Religious Movements in Religion and Literature. His position is housed at the GTU Center for Swedenborgian Studies, and much of his teaching and research remains focused on the 19th century cultural reception of the Scandinavian scientist turned mystic Emanuel Swedenborg. Dr. Zuber holds a PhD in English literature and an M philosophy from the CNY Graduate Center, an MA from Queens College, and a BA from Bryn Athyn College. Thank you so much for being here, my old friend Devin Zuber. You're going to talk about someone who I know almost nothing about, which is very exciting for me. I just want to give a couple of notes before we get started. If people have questions, please put them in the chat. We're going to kind of open it up to a more casual discussion space after we've been going. Dr. Zuber has a bunch of visuals for us, a bunch of cool slides. So be sure to pay attention to the screen. And we've got about 90 minutes this evening. And I think that's all. If I haven't forgotten anything, take it away.
Thank you, Eleanor. So lovely to see faces near and far. Some people I haven't seen in too long, and also some new faces. So I really appreciate it, especially on a Friday afternoon or evening, for zooming in to let me drone on about one of my favorite persons that I've had on my orbit of thinking and attention for a long time. I am not in my normal abode in Berkeley, in my office or at my home, and I'm not dressed for a formal lecture. I have been gardening all day as part of the Garden Church here in San Pedro, in Los Angeles, Greater County, and I have been running a farmer stand, among other things. So I'm a little dressed down than I would otherwise normally be for an academic kind of talk. And I'm currently perched in the temporary office space of the Garden Church, which is mostly an outdoor, oh yay, lots of wonderful people coming into the room. Yeah. And I'm really stoked to get to spend this time with all of you talking about Ivan Agueli. And I think in context of a lot of the other speakers that have been part of the series that the Cambridge Chapel has been running, Agueli might win the award for being the least well-known by American audiences. So I'm delighted to make him more on the attention of people who are interested in Swedenborg and the way he's impacted thought and philosophy. So my time with you is going to be split up into sort of two chunks. I do have some images to show related to Agueli, the painter. And I also want to talk about why I am interested in him in particular. He's part of a larger back-burner tabled second, third book project that one day I hope to have time to complete. So I want to tell you a little bit about why I'm interested in him. And we'll spend time looking at images today, slow looking over Zoom. We really need to see Agueli in person, regrettably, because the way he painted is often very thick on the canvas. It just doesn't carry over the same way on a Zoom screen. And the majority of all of his work is in Sweden, in Sala or Stockholm. So another reason for you to go to Scandinavia, especially if you're tracking Swedenborg, is to go see the work of Agueli in the National Museum or in Sala. And then I'll have a chat with all of you at the end. I'll probably talk for about 45 minutes or so. And I don't have a formal academic lecture prepared. I hope that's okay. I know you've had some really great speakers in this series who've given you dazzling, well-crafted presentations. That's not going to be the case with me, perched on a stool on sort of this busy street. There's a lot of noise outside I can't control, so I apologize for any background noise. While I'm giving my more formal walkthrough of my project and the life of Agueli, feel free to use the chat on the side to put in questions, comments, observations, and then when I resurface to the bigger Zoom room where all of you are located, we can use that to build a conversation together about Agueli. Before I go into, oh, here comes my mom. Before I go into my presentation, I would be curious to see a show of hands. Have any of you heard of Ivan Agueli prior to coming into this conversation? See a show. Yeah, see, it's so interesting that there's a lot of Swedenborgians here in the Zoom room who've been part of the tradition or interested in Swedenborg's impact on thought, culture, and art. You know your Emerson, you know your Blake. Maybe when you're having to explain to somebody in an elevator, who was Swedenborg? Why does he matter? You know names to say, but Ivan Agueli draws kind of a blank. And I think that's going to be different in 20, 30 years. He's going to be much more part of the story of why Swedenborg had this remarkable impact on moving between different religious traditions at the end of the 19th century, which is something I'm going to talk about in a minute. One other question I'd like to hold in front of us as we get into looking at some art is to think about how images can say things about spirituality that words cannot. What does it mean for a painting to work theologically or to depict higher unseen realities that maybe words cannot grasp? This is an acute problem for spiritually inclined artists at the dawn of the 20th century. And Agueli here shares in the same orbit as painters like Hilma af Klint, Vasily Kandinsky, who were turning towards abstract forms to depict higher kinds of reality. So if you know those guys, if you know Kandinsky, if you know especially Hilma af Klint, who's getting a lot of attention these days, changing the way we understand the history of abstraction, Agueli, in some cases, is in the same conversations and spaces that af Klint and Kandinsky are operating through. Okay, let's go into my presentation I prepared. And it's, as I've said, I'm sorry, it's not a more formal talk. You get sort of thought experiments about what I'm hoping to do in the book number 3, probably. I have another book in between that I have to finish before I can turn to this next project. All right. Can everybody see this okay? Yeah? All right. For whatever reason, hold on.
Yes.
All right. I'm going to try and get rid of the chat there. Okay. Are you able to see the whole screen? Because on
Yes.
my
Yes,
okay.
that's great.
Because my
Yes.
screen, you guys in the boxes on the side. So
You're perfect.
okay, sweet. So I have long been working on a book project on the side in between many other things. It's about conversion. I'm very interested in the ways that in the latter half of the 19th century, deep readers of Swedenborg became involved in religious pluralism and deep contact with other religious traditions outside the pale of Christianity. Pictured here on the left is our man of the hour, the person we're going to spend the most time with tonight, Ivan Agueli. And while Agueli, who is Swedish, is known in art history as being a key conduit for modernism in Scandinavian painting, he's the first Scandinavian writer in Swedish or Norwegian or Danish to write about Pablo Picasso and Cubism in Swedish. He's also the first Scandinavian convert to Islam. He becomes a Sufi at the end of his life, which is something I'm going to talk about. And that conversion story is facilitated in part by his deep reading of Swedenborg, the Scandinavian mystic, and a search for universal religion, universal spirituality. At the same time, Agueli was doing his thing around the fringes of Islam and living in Cairo in Egypt, which I'll talk more about today. On the west coast of California, quite close to some of us, another Swede named Herman Wetterling, quite a mouthful, changed his name to Phalangi Dasa, which is Tibetan, and began publishing the first Buddhist journal in North America out of a yurt-like cabin in the Santa Cruz Mountains in the 1880s. This journal was called the Buddhist Ray. You can see a picture here. I've not been able to find yet likenesses of Phalangi Dasa, aka Herman Wetterling. For a while, he was a ordained priest in the Swedenborgian church. He left it and then became this Buddhist. But if you squint your eyes and look at your screen, you can see under the heading for this first journal of Buddhism in North America, it says, it is devoted to Buddhism in general and to the Buddhism in Swedenborg in particular. So the story of American Buddhism begins by entangling Swedenborgian thought and philosophy with Buddhism. This is very interesting. So what was going on in the latter half of the 19th century, where encounters with Swedenborg didn't lead into Christian churches, into Swedenborgian churches per se, but to encounters of the other, into becoming Muslim, into publishing the first Buddhist journal and claiming a Buddhist identity. The other part of this conversion project spends a lot of time with the fellow on the right, and I think my friend Andrew, who's here tonight, will know who this is. Andrew, who do we have on the right wearing very cool, chic sunglasses? You have to unmute yourself.
I don't want to venture a guess.
It's one of your heroes, and it's related to your private email address.
That can't be William James.
That is William James on the right, a very young William James wearing sunglasses, not to be cool, but because he was on his famous expedition into the Amazonian jungle with Agassiz, and you had to wear glasses to protect your eyes from the sun. So William James, who, if you're interested in his philosophical importance, talk to Andrew Dodd here in the Zoom room, the father of pragmatism, the movement we call pragmatism. James is also central for the history of comparative religions. James gives a series of lectures in Scotland that then become a book called The Varieties of Religious Experience, which is published in 1903. And it's a fundamental text about the way mysticism and inner forms of spirituality became a way to try and move between different theological and religious traditions. So James is both the granddaddy of pragmatism as a philosophy, but also of religious psychology in America and comparative religions. And my book is interested in, of course, the ways that James is steeped in a Swedenborgian heritage, that he grows up as the son of one of the most influential 19th century Swedenborgians, Henry James Sr. So in my longer book project, besides Agueli on the left, Phalangi Dasa in the Santa Cruz Mountains with the Buddha Ray in the middle, and William James on the right, I'm looking at how William and his brother, Henry James, converted their Swedenborgian heritage into philosophy and into, in Henry's case, Henry, his brother, novels, into the late stage Henry James, these beautiful long novels that are very concerned with psychic transformations and questions of spirituality after the secular. So that's kind of the figures in my book in this larger project, where a chapter on Agueli is going to figure someday when I have time. It's going to be trying to trace kind of a global mapping that can account for how all these different figures around the same time are reading Swedenborg or coming out of a Swedenborgian context in a way that leads to deep pluralism and contact with religious others. There's one other thing in my book which I'm going to be dealing substantially with, not pictured here, but it's important just to raise up. And that happens in 1893. Does anyone know what that might be?
The World Parliament of Religions.
A World Parliament of Religions in Chicago, which brings together on a international level for the first time some of the major leading thought figures of non-Christian Asian religions, Buddhism, Hinduism, etc. And the intellectual scaffolding for the Chicago World's Parliament of Religions, which I won't spend too much time talking about today, was built on Swedenborgian theology. The architect of it, Charles Bonney, based in Chicago, was steeped in Swedenborgian theology and claimed Swedenborgian identity. So that's part of the horizon in the book there too. Less so than Agueli, James, Dasa here, where there's a question of how these conversionary moments are turns away from traditional theology into forms of art, into painting, into pragmatist philosophy or the fictional prose of Henry James. Okay. I want to let me share my screen. You guys can still see the slides, right?
Yes, it looks
Okay.
perfect.
All right, I can't, when I hit the arrow, it doesn't advance the slide. So let me see if I
don't know. Try restarting it.
Okay. All right, here we go again. There we go. Okay, so now we're going to get into this one chapter in the bigger book project about Agueli. And I'll begin a little bit with narrating his story biographically, because it's quite interesting. Agueli was born not Ivan, but John Gustav Agueli. And his parents are pictured here. His father on the left, Johann Gabriel Agueli, was a veterinarian who worked with animals. And Agueli was born and grew up in the town of Sala, S-A-L-A, which is somewhat close to Uppsala. If you know where Uppsala is in relationship to Stockholm, it's been very famous for a long time for its silver mine and its dependence on silver mining as a practice, which is interesting if you know the story of Swedenborg and his family connections to the copper mine in Falun. Agueli was much closer to his mother, Anna, pictured here on the right, who was a very kind and sweet person. And there's been a stipulation in scholarship that through his mother, Agueli was related to Swedenborg himself, to the Swedenborg family. I haven't yet found confirmation of that in Swedish scholarship, so I'm not going to make that claim tonight, but it's been posited by others who've tried to track how Agueli gets wrapped up in esotericism. His dad was not a nice guy. He was abusive. He beat his son regularly, at least according to some accounts, and he was very cruel to animals in spite of his veterinary practice. And Agueli would later remember the screams of the animals that his father was torturing in his animal praxis. So perhaps it's no surprise that early on, Agueli is not doing so well in school. He's a flunk out, drop out, kick-out kind of teenager who was expelled at least 5 different times from schools in the area. His parents, after he was kicked out of the local school in Sala, they sent him to Falun. That didn't work out. Vostoras, he even went to Visby, the capital city on the island of Gotland, very, very far away from his parents. That was also not so happy. And when Agueli first began to practice as an artist, he changed his name. The family surname is spelled Aguelli, Aguelli. It's a very unusual Swedish patronym. It probably has Finnish origins. When Agueli came into the world as an artist, from the get-go, he got rid of his name John, which was tied to his father, and became Ivan. And he changed the last name and added an accent mark, which makes it sound a little more French. So there's a story here about a struggle against his dad. We don't know when and how Agueli began reading seriously the work of Swedenborg, of Swedenborg. It's likely that his mother might have been one conduit. We know his mother was a member of a Swedish Swedenborgian church for a while. That could have been through her son, but it's also been posited that perhaps Anna was involved in the Swedenborgian church movement. And I just wanted to share a little bit of the depth of the importance of Swedenborg to Agueli in a late letter. So this is long after Agueli has converted to Islam and is a practicing Sufi and has lived in Cairo and has really fully gone onto the other side. And his mother was thinking about rejoining the state church of Sweden, the Lutheran church. And Agueli writes to her from far away, and he says, Swedenborg was a great man. In order to find someone like him in terms of spiritual enlightenment, we would need to go back many centuries and to the East. If we can move beyond Christ's name and from names and words to things in reality, you find Swedenborg's teachings, i.e. a great many of them, and the most essential confirmed thousands of years ago. I am working on a project concerning the secret doctrines of the East. And then, when it's finished, one will be able to see how great the similarities are between Swedenborg and the holy band of great souls. I am speaking of the saints and men of God who still protect the ordinary mortal when he leaves this world and approaches God, when one sees how the spiritual lineage goes from the secret teachings in the temples of Egypt, Assyria, and India to radiate at its brightest with the so-called fakirs and dervishes, and ends with the Swedenborgian light, and then one is close to seeing eternity ahead. There is much in Swedenborg that I do not accept, things here and there that I downright reject and contest, but that is perhaps because I have not understood him properly. But in any case, Swedenborg is the brightest spirit that Europe has brought forth since the beginning of time. Pretty high praise, right? You can hear too in this letter, this is a really, I think, indicative moment in Agueli where we can see him, like others of his time, like Hilma af Klint, locating Swedenborg in an intellectual genealogy shaped by theosophy, by the aims of Annie Besant, Ledbetter, others that saw behind the world's religious traditions, there was one secret esoteric teaching that bound them all together that one could access if one had the right keys. Agueli is reading Swedenborg here, even though he's converted to Islam, through a kind of theosophical lens. Agueli was wild. When he was in school in Visby, as his parents tried to send him to another place to settle down, another kind of boarding school experience, he was such a libertine, carousing in the streets, staying up all night, drinking, womanizing, that a friend wrote him a letter and said, if you're not careful, you're going to end up dead by the time you're 30. To which he replied, I certainly hope so. Life isn't worth living in any other way. And as we'll see, that's actually a very kind of prophetic moment, because Agueli's life is cut short far too early through very tragic circumstances. Not before 30, but certainly before his prime, and he still had much more to offer. So we'll come to the end of his life at the end of my presentation. I'm showing this beautiful painting. This is an example of typical Agueli cityscape of Stockholm, because it shows the part of Stockholm where Agueli found a spiritual refuge from the pain and brutality of his home in Sala. When he moved to Stockholm to go to another school, he became friends with Einar Boyesen. And for those of you in the Zoom room that might know some Boyesens affiliated with the Swedenborgian tradition, same family. The pastor of the Swedenborgian church in Stockholm at the turn of the 20th century was Adolf Boyesen. And he took Agueli in, and Agueli lived with the family for a period of time. Agueli fell in love with Boyesen's daughter even. There was a little potential romance there. And this is another context where the reading of Swedenborg and the practice of Swedenborgian teachings in a religious family really gave him an anchor. And this painting that he does a little bit later after this Boyesen phase is of the area of the city where he would have lived with the Boyesen family in Norrmalm, Vasastan area, if you know Stockholm, which are the districts above the island of Gamla Stan. So we're going to come back to this painting later when I ask all of you to maybe look at it more slowly and think about what might be resonating for you spiritually when you view this. Because by this point in the 1890s, when Agueli is painting, he's doing it through a sense of prophetic vocation that his painting was meant to distill the spiritual essence of reality, akin to all his explorations in other world religions and languages. So, like all good bad boys of the late 19th century, the city to go to was not Stockholm, it was Paris. So Agueli ends up at the end of the 19th century hanging out with the coolest kids in the room, the nobbies. He began taking art lessons at an academy, but dropped out after 2 days because he couldn't stand the academic rules and regulations. And he quickly took up with a group of painters, including Emile Bonnard, who's pictured here on the left. This is a famous self-portrait of Bonnard, who was part of a group that called themselves the Nobbies, N-A-B-I-S, the Nobbies. And maybe make a note for yourself on the side. This is a really exquisite moment of painting with deep spiritual aspirations at the close of the 19th century. The word Nobby, does anyone know what the word Nobby means, where it comes from, why they called themselves that? Without Googling? No cheating. It comes from Hebrew. It's the Hebrew word for prophet. So the Nobbies were a group of painters that saw their practice as artists through a theological lens, that their work was meant to show deep spiritual themes. You see that a little bit. These are two paintings on the right beside this one of Bonnard, not by Agueli. These are famous works by Bonnard that are in Barcelona. No, they're in Madrid. They're in a collection in one of the museums in Madrid. I can't remember. I saw it last year when I was there at Easter time with my kids. It's the Annunciation and another painting. The Nobbies were very interesting because they didn't just paint spiritually themed pictures. They tried to live a different life. They wore simple clothing. They did theosophical rituals, and politically, they were closely affiliated with anarchism, which was kind of the anarchism and communism are sort of the preferred political postures for a lot of avant-garde artists at the end of the 19th century in Paris. And Agueli was very, very much at home in those circles. Friends of his at the time write how Agueli quickly became initiated into secret societies that were full of gypsy mysticism that would do various things at night. One of Agueli's closest confidants, who became his lover, was this woman, Madame Marie Huot. And I apologize in advance. One of my great deficiencies as a scholar trying to track Agueli, which requires a lot of French because he wrote a lot of things in French. I don't speak French. I barely read it well with a dictionary. So I know we have a native French speaker in the Zoom room. I apologize for my bad pronunciation. I hope one day there's a movie made about this lady. She was such an incredible person of her day and age. Radical feminist, supporting political reform to give women the right to vote and to have more equal footing in terms of property rights in France. Like Agueli, and Agueli is deeply influenced by this in her, she was a radical animal rights activist, a vegetarian, who also tried to stop the practice of animal testing, of what in the 19th century was called vivisection, where doctors would perform experiments on animals for the purposes of research. Famously, she was almost arrested for beating a doctor during a public vivisection lecture on a monkey, where he was cutting a live monkey on the table, and she attacked him with her parasol to stop it. She also talked about, in very interesting ways that sort of echo contemporary conversations about climate change, that given our destructive force on planet Earth, maybe the human race should stop propagating itself to give the chance for the well-being of the planet to recover. She gives a lecture about this in 1909 or 1910. So very ahead of her day. Agueli's lover. And under her influence, Agueli began to do radical politics. He got into a lot of trouble with the French police for attempting to assassinate a bullfighter. Bullfighting was very big in Paris, picked up as a cultural practice from the Spanish. And Agueli and others in his circles felt like this was very, very cruel. And Agueli tried, without success, fortunately, to assassinate a French matador that was in Paris. Agueli did end up, here's a very beautiful from Agueli's sketchbook. And I think that the more intimate details of his relationship with Madame Huot are not so well known, but certainly the tenderness and the closeness, I think, of their relationship, you can see this in this sketch. This is a face he has cherished and studied closely. It's very beautiful. Agueli does get imprisoned, not for trying to assassinate the bullfighter, but for housing in his apartment in Paris people who were blowing stuff up in the name of anarchism. So the police in Paris really didn't like this. And when they arrest Agueli in 1894 and put him here in the Mazas prison, which was notorious for housing intellectual dissidents, anarchists, no-gooders like Agueli, in the logbook kept by the French police, under occupation, Agueli wrote, he could have written painter, but no, he writes that he is, quote, a Swedenborgian anarchist, end quote. And I thought about, that could be another title of my talk for this evening, if I wanted to be really sensationalist and bring people in. Agueli, Swedenborgian anarchist. It's really while he's in prison that we know he begins to really deeply read Swedenborg, because of the letters that have been saved that he wrote to friends outside. Agueli had a good sense of humor. He wrote to one friend while he was in the Clapper that he didn't mind it so much because the prison was, quote, less boring than Sweden. This is someone who spent most of their life creating art, working through other languages far away from his homeland. So at least it was better than Sweden, he says. And especially in the letters, Agueli writes to a Finnish artist named Verner von Halsen. German name, but he was living in Finland. We know that Agueli is reading Swedenborg's True Christian Religion every day. It was his daily bread, Agueli writes to his friend, reading TCR, True Christian Religion, Swedenborg's last big magnum opus, published originally in 1771. This and the Hebrew Bible. And through his artist friends who weren't in prison in Paris, Agueli gets them to send him more or less a whole library of books, including lots of Swedenborg, but also lots of language books. And really, we could trace in these letters from the prison time, Agueli, who clearly was a genius, immersing himself in other languages in a theosophical quest to try and find the inner spiritual teachings that would unite different religious traditions together. So you find evidence of this in his notebooks. He becomes fluent in Arabic. We see here on the left some of his Arabic notations as he's thinking about, in the Sufi tradition, the many names of the divine, of Allah. In the middle of the page is him practicing Chinese in Chinese characters. And on the far right, we have Tibetan, the Tibetan numbered system. This is an autodidact, someone who teaches himself these other languages through the Gospel of John. His father had been very strict in the Lutheran church at home and had forced his son to memorize word for word in Swedish the entire Gospel of John. He knew it by heart, backwards and forwards, left and right. You could probably mention, oh, recite for me chapter 5, verse 4, and Agueli could give it to you in Swedish. So some of the books he requested to be brought into the prison were Bibles in other languages, so he could learn their grammar and their language backwards. So it's quite fascinating for me. And even though he's got these sort of broad-ranging theosophical interests in other world religions, it's through the Gospel of John that he gains his first footholds in these other languages that are far outside. And a lot of the letters from prison, the letters he writes to Werner von Hausen, are in French. So I haven't been able to ascertain this, but I'm pretty sure the True Christian Religion Agueli is reading, a Swede imprisoned in France, is in French. He's reading Swedenborg in French, probably not in Swedish, not in English, not in Latin, but in French. And Hebrew becomes very important to Agueli too. He's reading the Hebrew Bible, reciting it out loud. And this certainly comes for him from Swedenborg's privileging of the Hebrew language as being akin to what is spoken in heaven by the angels. He's also getting very into esotericism. If I had more time, I would talk about this with all of you. This is a page from Agueli's notebook where we can see him playing around with Cornelius Agrippa, maybe the most important figure of the Western esoteric tradition, and alchemy, with the figure of the tetragram, which Agueli maps out onto the human body in very interesting kinds of ways. And that attempt to meld an esoteric higher reality into how the human body is configured together is certainly one way to begin thinking about Agueli's portraiture and how he depicted the human body. These are two exquisite studies he did for paintings, early Agueli, but you can just really get a sense of his mastery of draftsmanship and the human form. Let's see where we are. Another interesting text Agueli devours, and it becomes an important part of his painting philosophy, was a strange book by a Frenchman, first published in 1837. I won't mangle the pronunciation and be taken to task by our French speaker in the Zoom room. This is about the symbolic value of color. And the author, Frédéric Portal, was steeped in Swedenborg. And there are one-to-one correlations between the value of color and their spiritual affect with the writings of Swedenborg. He places special emphasis on red and blue and the color pink that bear an analog to how Swedenborg talks about those colors in the Arcana Caelestia. Portal even says in this book that these spiritual doctrines of color are confirmed by Pico Mirandola and Swedenborg. So Swedenborg is cited in the text as a guiding kind of figure. With this in the background, I want to look at one of the letters from prison that Agueli writes to his friend, this Finnish artist, Verner von Hausen. And clearly Agueli is responding to questions that his friend is sending him in prison, like, what do you believe? What do you think about painting? And Agueli gives a really concrete distillation of how his syncretic spiritual values were fusing into his painting praxis. Would somebody like to read this out loud? Because I've been talking a lot and I need to take a swig of water. Would someone like to read this letter Agueli writes to Verner von Hausen out loud? Any volunteers?
I'll give it go ahead, Leah.
Okay. What my faith consists of. What is Christianity? First and foremost, monotheism. Belief in and yearning for a single supreme being. A supreme locus of greatness and universality and a source of life. A creator, the only being who possesses an essential and substantial life, and above all else, comprehensible. The creator who forms the heavens and the earth out of nothing, and who brings forth the light of the word. Monotheism is the religion of those who hate the worship of fetishes, and who possess the gift of being able to collect oneself in concentration. Belief in a supreme being, which is above all else Allah. Monotheism is the essence of Christ's teachings, so significant that the faithful Muslim is more Christian than most Christians.
Thank you, Leah. Well read. And wow, what a statement, right? The faithful Muslim is more Christian than most Christians. We can unpack that later, in the plenary session when I end my presentation. And this artist he's writing to is pictured here on the right. This is a portrait by another one in this circle of artists from Scandinavia that were in Paris around the Nobbies. Very beautiful. It's not by Agueli. I don't know if Agueli has a sketch or a portrait of von Hausen. And I think for me, this raises an interesting question in lots of ways. One is certainly, how does this impact his practice as a painter? What might this fundamental belief in a kind of monotheism mean for how one represents reality? There are other letters, I don't have them as part of my presentation here, that scholars have used to talk about how Agueli created monotheistic landscapes through a Swedenborgian lens. One of the central metaphors for divinity in Swedenborg, as those of you who've read his text know, is to compare the divine to the sun, that there's a spiritual sun flowing into our world of appearances with divine love and wisdom through influx that creates reality. So in a lot of Agueli's landscapes, the sun and how the light works are a central organizing motif. And we can turn to that in a minute after we look at this other letter. So here's again writing to von Hausen, more about his religion. And as I read this one out loud, maybe think about where it hits landscape as a practice. Agueli says, admit that a landscape can reflect the state of mind. The monotheistic landscape is very sunny, illuminated by a penetrating sun, a light strong enough to let the aerial perspective supersede the linear perspective. In it, light masters matter. Religion is decisive for the sun and the landscape within me. That is why I love monotheism and the Arabic spirit. And, we can pardon the Orientalism there. If the landscape is the soul's mirror, then the sky and the Lontane, which is a particular term about the remote landscape, correspond, you can hear Swedenborg there, correspond to the lofty and intimate principles and the foreground to the lower principles. When one travels, one constantly sees the sky as unmoving, while the level of the terrain changes unceasingly. The first every moment, the other less quickly, and the Lontane almost not at all. Who finds a moral satisfaction? Who a sine qua non for the inner equilibrium, his center of gravity, so to speak, in the objects in the first level, a nearsighted talent given to fetish worship and facile pleasures, who goes from mistake to mistake, and when his idol has been crushed, which sooner or later is going to happen, will be immediately knocked down. Let us then break down our idols before they cause our fall. That is my religion in summary, perspectival logic. Very complex, compressed paragraph. And for me, it's a fascinating moment of conversion in the sense that a lot of theological discourse is being translated into a painterly praxis for a way to create a landscape. So what does it mean on either end for perspectival logic, for landscape aesthetics to be religion in summary? I think this is a problem for figures like Agueli at the end of the 19th century, where Swedenborg helps facilitate this transfer of doctrine, of theology, into a problem of representation that painting is supposed to puzzle through and work out. So with this question, what does it mean for a landscape to be a religion? Let's look again at some of Agueli's landscapes. So I'm going to pause. I'm going to leave the screen to go get a glass of water. I've been talking all day at the farmer's market here at the garden church, so my throat is a little parched. Take a couple of moments to just think about what you're looking at. Here in Stockholm Utsikt, Husgavlar under Himmelsbåge, which means street view of Stockholm, House Gables under the Ark of Heaven, comes from 1892. And then we'll sort of canvass the room and see what you've seen. So I'll be right back. So, of course, you need to see this in person at the National Museum in Stockholm. I hope you get to see it if you go there. I think that's where this painting is located. It might be at the Valdemarsud. What do you notice? And we have at least two painters here looking at this, if not three. So artists, what jumps out to you in terms of composition and how this is put together?
The first thing I notice is that everything has a certain flatness and graphic treatment to it. And that involved in that is a lot of linearity that he, in his writing, seemed to be something he disdained. So I'm very surprised.
Yeah. In that lower half, excellent. I don't have it as part of my slide presentation, regrettably, but Agueli did do these interesting landscapes that seem to be as if you're in a train moving through the countryside, where the lower part is blurring and the definition is in the upper part of the canvas, in the way he sort of described. Yeah, great observation, Andrew. Thank you.
And the source of light to me is hard to determine. It almost seems as though the light is coming from the viewer,
Yes,
or from somewhere behind the viewer.
exactly. Very good. Illuminating a path we are following somewhere. Yes. Anybody else?
The first thing that I notice, well, the first thing that I notice is the arc on the back, which I initially read as mountain.
Yeah.
And then the title says with the arc of heaven. So there's this kind of ambiguity between kind of sky, heaven, and earth thing happening. The second thing that I noticed is that there was a new availability of certain types of blue pigments that shows up during this time period. And there's a lot of, you can almost date paintings by when certain blue pigments become available. And I'm seeing that like late 19th century Prussian blue, and then that affects the way light shows up.
Yeah, fantastic.
It becomes it becomes important for like painting skin tones and painting all of, so it affects the way that we were thinking about light. So those are the two things that spring to mind.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you, Eleanor. That's a beautiful materialization of how the blue here, which is so prominent, is materialized, made available for Agueli. And Eleanor is exactly right that the title is interesting. That the Swedish here, which is like German, Himmel, it
was lively.
Can be both sky and heaven.
Right. Sounds cool.
It is cool. Whoops.
And if we think of this as not earthly sky, but heaven, the heaven, might we say anything from a Swedenborgian perspective for those of you who read Swedenborg?
Yes, there's 3 of them.
Yes.
The natural, the spiritual, and the celestial.
Very good.
That's what jumped out for me.
Right on, Kim. And maybe you were shy and didn't think, well, that's too obvious, but it's quite interesting. Across Agueli's landscapes from this period, he often creates these layers, which often are 3. So given what we know, how he was so immersed in heaven and hell and true Christian religion, these other books he's reading in prison and elsewhere, you're on good ground. Art historians since the 1940s have been saying, well, maybe this is akin to what Swedenborg says about the celestial, the spiritual, and the natural heavens that flow into one another. You see a little bit of that in this too. This is one of my favorite landscapes. I wonder if anyone in the Zoom room has been to Gotland in the Baltic, which is this large island that belongs to Sweden. No, you must go someday. The city of Visby there is extraordinary, filled with many, many medieval churches. Visby was very rich in the medieval era, so they built beautiful medieval churches. And it's been a destination for artists from the 18th century onwards to go to because of all the water around the island that catches the light. So if you're doing landscape, it's a really spectacular thing. And maybe, Andrew, here more than the other one, there's a sense of the celestial really being the focus of the painting that takes us up. But I think, again, it's interesting to think, where is the sun located? How does the absence of a clear sun make our eye look and want to find the source of light in interesting ways?
I think it's a definite choice to not have the sun in the frame of view, but be extra outside of this world entirely.
Yeah. Yeah. These remind me too, when I look at them, of other artists of the period, like Edvard Munch in Norway, much more well-known, famous for the screen, but also exquisite landscape painter, who also was familiar with Swedenborg through his contact with August Strindberg, the playwright and painter who he hung out with in Berlin. So to bring things to a head, because I want to have a little bit of time to go back to plenary and hear thoughts and take in ideas, as I'm still in the draft stage of this book, one day to be finished. In 1895 to 1896, Agueli lived for a year in Cairo, Egypt. When he returns to Paris, he converts to Islam. He undergoes an initiation into a Sufi order and becomes the first modern Scandinavian convert to Islam. He's pictured here. This is a later picture from when he returns to Cairo of a group of writers and activists who were largely Arabic, but also Italian, who published a journal devoted to the cause of Sufism in Italian. So Agueli mastered another language and wrote essays in Italian for this journal, Il Convito. And it's in this journal that Agueli creates, I believe it's the first time it appears in a European language, the term Islamophobia, in responding to the way the West responds to Islam. Agueli writes in defense of the spiritual beauty and importance for Islam as a spiritual practice. He writes about the Islamophobia of modern Western Europe. That term's become very ubiquitous, especially in America post 9/11 and the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan. But Agueli, a Swedenborgian anarchist, coins the term in this journal in the early 20th century. It gets picked up later by other intellectuals. Agueli returns. This is a lovely. This is Agueli in that first trip in 1894 into 1896 when he's in Cairo, looking quite dapper. On his longer time in Cairo, when he returns in 1902, Agueli has become so fluent in Arabic that he applies and is accepted to Al-Azhar University, which was an Islamic university in Cairo. And there's another first. Agueli was the first Arabic-speaking Westerner to be allowed to matriculate at an advanced level at Al-Azhar University. He continues to practice his Sufism, and at a certain point, he is initiated into a secret Sufi order and accepted as a brother by practicing Sufis in Cairo. There's a long period here during the Egyptian years where Agueli stops painting. It's been said, wrongly so, I think, that this is because of his religious beliefs, that somehow Agueli's understanding of prohibitions against representation meant he had to give up landscape painting. That's not the case. I agree with Simon Sorgenfrey, whose work I'm really indebted to. He's a scholar of Agueli and Islam in Scandinavia at Södertälje University in Stockholm. Agueli probably stops painting because he's too busy studying, because he's at university and he really wants to get immersed in Arabic and the languages and practice. He does begin painting again during his time in Cairo, and there's exquisite portraiture he does of Egyptians he was close to in Cairo. Here's two examples, a study in his notebooks, and then a lovely, although much damaged, portrait of a young girl from 1914. So long after the Islamic conversion, Agueli is still painting figuratively and dealing with representation of persons and people. And I think I will end. I have some more slides I could show you, but I want to leave time for some chat at the end with one of the landscapes that Agueli does from his time immersed in Egypt. Staden bland Colonna, Landskap från Egypten, the city in the hills, a landscape from Egypt. And ask you again to maybe pause and tell me what you see in this Egyptian landscape, the city in the hills that Agueli creates after his conversion and after spending his time in Cairo. If anything jumps out at you. And if we were in the museum where this is displayed, I would ask us to spend, minutes in silence looking at slow seeing, like a good practice, like slow eating, but we'll take less time now because we're on Zoom.
Well, it's extremely peaceful. And I'm struck by the interplay of the warm and cool tones. It's almost a dual color palette entirely.
Yes.
And the heavens are they're centered right over the city, as if the city and the heavens were directly connected somehow.
The city and the heavens connected somehow. Excellent that this is formally done with the composition. Yeah.
Mm.
Anybody else?
I was just gonna say, it seems infused with light, right?
Yes. Yeah.
It's like very light and bright.
Light and bright. Thank you, Kim. And
God
again,
everywhere.
yeah, exactly. I was hoping somebody would say that. That's my sense of it too, is that, again, because of the lack of there being a clear source of the sun, it's diffused and becomes luminous. There's a numinosity in the landscape. And we know, if we track some of the letters that Agueli writes to his friends about how he's reading Swedenborg, he's also very into the idea of influx, this idea that the divine permeated every aspect of nature and was flowing behind things. And Agueli also saw this in terms of the way the entire world of appearances was in respiration, kind of an influx of breath in and out, in the way Swedenborg saw the whole cosmos as a giant figure of a human, sort of an esoteric idea that there's parallels with the Kabbalah that he was also into. And to me, this landscape breathes. There's a similar presence of light that's ubiquitous, that suggests a movement to it that's quite beautiful. Interesting, we don't have the same very strong 3 levels that we observed earlier in the Stockholm painting, and also to a lesser degree in the Visby Gotland landscape. But there's a palpability, something almost tactile about the light in this painting that's very, very beautiful. So I'm sorry to end on a bad note, but that's the story of Agueli's life. Because he had lived in Cairo for so long, if you know the history of the colonial presence of Western powers in Egypt, it's very sad. You know, a lot of things being stolen, like and carted off back to other places, but also proxy wars being fought out. And the Ottomans, the Turkish Empire, which had vested interest in Egypt, they thought Agueli was a spy, spying for the French or the British, and they kicked him out. They made him leave his community. And Agueli never had great commercial success back home in Stockholm. He had some late in life patronage from a wealthy prince, Prince Eugen, who built the beautiful Valdemar Sud Villa on Djurgården, which you can still go to as an art space in Stockholm, where some of Agueli's paintings are on the wall. But more or less penniless, destitute, he had to return to Europe. So he took a boat from Egypt to Spain, landed in Barcelona, and we don't know what happened. It's a mystery, but at some point, at the age of 48, which is not too much older than I am right now, it still seems young. In 1917, he was run over by a train. He was either murdered, thrown in front of the train, or committed suicide, or it was an accident. We just don't know. He was hit by a train. And thank goodness, because of this late in life noble patronage from Prince Eugen back in Stockholm, Eugen paid for all the painting that Agueli was carting with him after his exile from Egypt to come back to Sweden, which means we have some of these late in life paintings. They didn't get lost or destroyed. They could have very easily have slipped away given Agueli's destitution at this point. So it's an incredible life story with a lot of firsts that takes us to Cairo, to Paris, and beyond. And I hope to join this group of scholars that are giving more attention to Agueli. There's been a little bit of an Agueli renaissance in the last 7 to 10 years, primarily in Scandinavia from scholars who are working in Swedish, in art history, but also religious studies, people like Simon Sorgenfrey. But still today, he's not very well known. If he's known to English academics, it's usually through the history of Sufism in the West. One of the people Agueli initiates into his Sufi order is a Frenchman named René Guénon, Guenon, who's a major figure for the history of esoteric Islam in the 20th century, especially in France. So there's been a lot of sort of attention from French religious historians to Agueli, but his painting, his religious philosophy is less well known. So I'm going to stop and let people engage, ask questions, or talk amongst yourselves about what this made you think or feel looking at paintings and the like.
Thank you so much, Devin. That was absolutely fascinating. That was exactly what I needed to hear. And just 2 days ago, I was talking about Kabi Kant's conversion experience and kind of how the Swedenborgian Church in the West responds and has responded historically to the engagement with Swedenborg from people who do not identify as Christian and all the weird complexity in that. So I'm so thrilled that you're doing this research. And I'm going to put you in contact with my friend who's actually pulling together all of this stuff for Kabi Kant's the 100-year anniversary of his death. Amazing stuff. I just absolutely fascinating talk. I'm so glad that you could grace us with all of this knowledge. Yeah, I if anyone else has comments or questions, now's the time.
Ellie, maybe I'll offer just a quick response to was he a theosophist? Was he involved in theosophy circles?
Not directly,
Okay.
as far as I know. I'm not too much of a Kant specialist, but because he made a really big deal about conversion.
Yeah.
Which is like he had a whole kind of public thing where he cut his Brahmanical thread, and then he got really kind of ostracized by his family, and you know, and at the same time he's writing this incredible kind of ecstatic poetry about Swedenborg. So there's this interesting dichotomy that you get where you have people who, you know, convert in their hearts. Like you fall in love with Jesus, you fall in love with some vision of God, whatever that is, and there's this heart conversion. But then there's also the social aspect. Yeah. And so really what I've been exploring with Kant is, you know, Swedenborg doesn't really, you can't really defend the idea that Swedenborgians should be going out converting people, because of what he says about, you know, anyone who has love for God in the human form is in society with Christians in heaven. So there's not really a lot of doctrinal grounds to like this idea of kind of an expansionist crusade.
I think, and many of you know William Blake's poem published in 1793, right, as Blake is involved in debates about what the Swedenborgian church should look like and do. And Blake has a beautiful poem called The Divine Image, which ends with, in heathen, Turk, or Jew, mercy, pity, peace, and love are, there God is dwelling too. So that's an interesting moment where you can see a very early reader of Swedenborg, in heathen, Turk, or Jew. There's a post-Christian, there's a movement outside through Swedenborgian theology to others. And I think
and those others talk back.
yeah,
And sometimes the organized church isn't too comfortable with those others talking back.
I agree 100%. I think that's one reason why figures like both, if you remember, I started putting these three people up. William James, in the middle was Falangi Dasa in the mountains above Santa Cruz. Dasa and Agueli were in these theosophical orbits. And I think that one reason they were there is because the church was closed off to some of those conversations. And it was in the other spaces that these networks formed in interesting ways.
Have you seen the very spicy published review of Swedenborg the Buddhist that's in New Church Life from 1888?
I have seen it. They hated it.
It's a weird book. But what I find really interesting is that you have this this Western perspective on the other, this Westerner kind of taking on the role of the other, and then the Swedenborgians end up arguing with that, and arguing with kind of that version of what the other is projected as from a Swedenborgian perspective. Well, there are all of these other voices that are people who are actively engaging with Swedenborg in often a much more positive way. And yet there's a reluctance to, they wouldn't even publish Gopal Chetty's book.
It's almost a history of missed opportunities and shut down dialogues. It is sad, which I think makes sort of the recovery work. And I count your work on Chetty, Eleanor, here as part of the force field of reclaiming these lost stories.
It's very important.
Which are very much outside the history of church and polity, in the space of art and culture. And maybe one thing to say, and then I've talked too much. I want to hear from all of you.
I think Andrew has a question, but
oh yeah,
go ahead.
Okay, Andrew, go for it.
I actually don't have a question, but I have kind of an observation, and that's, I'm not sure where this leads, but I think that there is a distinction between an intellectual pursuit or curiosity and the pursuit of a creative expression. Those are in a way two different lives within an individual, and they don't always mesh, they don't always run parallel, and they can often run in different directions from one another at the same time, as one is more and more avidly exploring what being is and what God is, and how one has a relation to the divine. I think that each person's journey, like through that maze, is very individual. But so I think that what I'm curious about is to see more of Ivan's work, and to see a sort of development and change in those, to see how they went. Because one can explore things on an intellectual level that may express differently in art. And I think one experiences God more through art, or as the Sufis would probably suggest, through dance and ecstatic experience, than through intellectual dissection.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. That's really, I think that's crucial, is that Agueli didn't just become any kind of Muslim, that he chose to initiate himself with the most aesthetically rich, embodied tradition full of dance and ecstasy, and so that's
there's also,
I'm sure it was much more interesting, to quote him again, about being in prison is better than being in Sweden, much more interesting than the Lutheran Church of the late 19th century, right?
Sure. I mean, there's so much more immersement of the whole being in that kind of practice. I spent nearly a year or so involved with the Sufi group in San Francisco, whom you know puts a lot of emphasis on singing and dancing. And it was wonderful. And it was a way for me to release and let go of where my prior history had come from and was leading me, and actually helped lead me towards the Swedenborgian Church, oddly enough. But I think that someone exploring different traditions and different ways of thinking, different languages, different cultures, is going to have an extremely complex journey to express in whatever way they choose to express them, whether it's through poetry or through art, through paintings, or music. It's going to be a completely, continually evolving experience and expression. So I want to see more. I want to delve into this person more. I wish that he had lived longer, because it would have been interesting to see what would have happened towards the latter part of his life.
Agreed. Thank you, Andrew.
Something that you said, Andrew, that really resonated with me was how seeing Swedenborg in that context drew you into the church. And I'm thinking there are different ways of spreading religion, of spreading ideas, of spreading spiritual societies. There's this kind of triumphalist model that is one where you have to be in control in an institutional way. And then there's, the model of sublimation and conversation. And that if you can be, the tradition whose tradition it is to talk to everyone, and not in a way that puts us in power over the narrative and puts us in power over institutions, but actually gives away our power. And kind of give other people opportunities to converse with us, give other people opportunities to express how they feel about certain ideas. And I think in the long run, the second model is actually has a lot more staying power. And if you look at, there's something very powerful in the being nice, and being nice on kind of like a global level. Like what if we actually start listening to people and start giving away our control? I think that's the only way the church is going to survive.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, I think Swedenborg would say that's where the joy is.
Amen.
And perhaps this is one reason why Swedenborg did not establish a church or a tradition, but published these lavishly expensive books at his own expense, which were commercial flops and failures that had, a very interesting subsequent posthumous reception history. Too, he wasn't screaming on the corner of London with broadsheets, trying to build a political base or a polity. Yeah, I mean, maybe one thing I want to say quickly, I know we're coming up on the end of our time, but I'm interested in the idea of conversion too. That was really shaped and helped by my chance to co-teach a class on conversion narratives with Nomi Seidman, who ran the Center for Jewish Studies at the GTU, who's a wonderful literary critic and scholar, expert on Yiddish literature. And it was sort of a cross comparison about this question of conversion, which has sort of haunted Christian and Jewish relationships for a long time, with kind of a lot of violence and trauma kind of embedded in it. And I think Swedenborg, in a way, is anti-conversion in the sense that he is so critical of the Christian polemics of his day that had been so focused on belief. Religion's all about like, do you believe in this kind of Trinity or this kind of baptism or this triangulation of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit? And that comes out of the bloody after effect of the Reformation that tore Europe apart. That was still very fresh for someone in the 18th century. That was just, 1 or 2 generations behind, where people were literally slicing each other's throats because they believe different, abstract ideas about God. And to be a little reductive, I think Swedenborg's work could be said to say that it's not about belief and converting to this or that. It's about how you live. It's about how the beliefs shape a practice of being in the world. So when I use conversion in my bigger project, I'm going to have to sort of talk about not just these later figures who are playing around with conversion in interesting ways, but embedded in, and I think this is why we can talk about Swedenborg as the Buddha of the North, right? You've probably heard that phrase. It's older than D.T. Suzuki, who publishes the book in Japanese about Swedenborg. He gets it from Balzac, the French writer, who publishes a novel in 1833, Louis Lambert, where we get this framing of Swedenborg as outside of Christianity in interesting ways. And I do think that maybe that's been a little underutilized, or the dial's been turned down by church traditions that have wanted to say, no, we're just like all you other Protestants, and we're good people. And we go to church on Sunday, and we love the King. Not anarchists. We wave our flags. We're patriotic. We're good Christians who support the country and the state. The reading Swedenborg as a Buddha has not happened in the church. It's happened outside by a Suzuki, by Balzac, by Agueli. What does it mean to have an occupation as a Swedenborgian anarchist? Put that on your resume.
Yeah, there's conversion religion-wise, but I think Swedenborg's only effort of conversion is he's trying to convert people into being kind.
Beautifully
being
put.
kind and being loving and love your neighbor, and he's just carrying on Jesus's work, right? And
yeah,
he just wants us all to not waste our time here on earth, to do this business of regeneration, purposefully every day, so that we're enhancing that grand human. And I think that's the only thing he's trying to convert a bunch of selfish people into loving people.
Beautifully put. Yeah, and that, rather than the energy being about like, how do you publicly profess this or that confessionally, it's an inner process. Conversion becomes regeneration. It becomes organicized. It's sort of Swedenborg, the natural scientist. Conversion is something that never ends. Famously, I'm going to talk about this more in my book, but both William and Henry James grew up in a household where their dad, Henry Sr., who's one of the most important 19th century readers of Swedenborg, he famously told his kids they had to convert. Their experience every day was a new chance to internalize what they were doing and how they were living in the world and make something with it. I thought maybe that would be a title for the book, convert. But then I think it would people get the wrong message. They think it's some evangelical propaganda, and no academic press would touch it with a 10-foot pole. So
in a way, that's what Swedenborg did that was so Buddhistic, was to focus people on their internal reality, to be mindful of themselves and their place in the world and what their actions and thoughts were doing, and to be honest. The ultimate in knowing thyself, to be aware always of what your own intentions are. And he did so by pointing out the intentions of others, by spending so much time on how what other people were using their time on earth to do for themselves rather than for others. So that was like the heart of the crux of the human self-centered consciousness is to be aware of your own values and what you're putting forth in the world. So there's a certain, direction towards compassion there by noticing that your tendencies in others and others' tendencies in you for your own spiritual development. That's what I find a lot often repeated.
Thank you, Andy.
The interoception thing is everything. It's the heart of Swedenborg, and this gets back to this idea of like the body as a unifying force, that because our interoceptive awareness is our embodied awareness, and so there's some connection between this kind of incarnate scripture and Christ and yoga and breathing and brains, and it's very complex and very simple.
Yeah, a meditation practice I do that starts with breathing, but is a scan of the body. So you become completely aware of the body and separate, your awareness of it and your awareness of your own awareness, paying attention to that. So how that centers us is what I think is very interesting. That the fact that Swedenborg had his own method of breathing that probably, brought that centeredness and clarity to enable him to be receptive to the visions that he had.
Amen.
Yeah, like the human brain, the gray matter itself is just a receiver, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if we aren't breathing right and managing that whole connection right, like down to sleeping right and eating right and like all of that has to be in tune so that we're receiving the right information, not our self-generated random thoughts, right? That aren't going to help anybody.
Well,
But
and that was kind of one of Swedenborg's major leaps. Was he was one of the first people, pre-Swedenborg. We have Rene Descartes. We might go over a few more minutes. I'm sorry if anyone needs to leave. But I'm gonna nerd out on brains because I only live once. When you look at pre-Swedenborg, what Descartes is saying is that the cerebrum doesn't do anything, and then Swedenborg starts looking at the limbic system. He starts looking at the way blood flow is working, and he's saying, wait a minute, there is a connection between experiences and how our brains work and how we behave. And so all of these things that were labeled as sin by the church, Swedenborg is saying, this is something that's in your experience. This is something that's, what you are is much more intimately connected to your body than, anyone ever gave anybody credit for. Do you have any last words, Dr. Zuber?
Breathe.
Breathe.
It
Breathe. Amen.
was fun. Thanks. To be continued. And I hope this will come to fruition in the years to come, and that all of you are now interested in this figure. I think everyone should know more about Agueli because he's he places Swedenborgian ideas at the table with some really important ideas of modernity that we still wrestle with. Islamophobia. How do we deal with the religious other? Can experiencing a painting be spiritual? Can it be spiritually nourishing? I think Agueli wasn't just representing some belief. He wants you to be transformed. Like the painting of the light, Kim, that you helped us bring out, the Egyptian landscape. That's I think if you spend time with something like that, it's supposed to produce an effect.
Another
on
way
you
to look at his
as a
art,
viewer.
another way to
Not-
look at his art, Devin, is that he was exploring his spirituality through his art. But that was another kind of direct experience or conversion experience. It wasn't necessarily all expression. It was partially exploration.
Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, this was fun. Thanks, everyone. Happy
Thank
Friday.
you so
Happy
much.
weekend.
Our next lecture is going to be Carl Von Essen, May 19th. Keep your eye out on Facebook and in the Messenger and in the